Let's get right into it. Imagine a cold December night in 1988. A jumbo jet literally falls out of the sky over Scotland. This kicks off one of the most complicated criminal investigations you can imagine. The puzzle seemed completely impossible. I mean, the crime scene was the size of a city, but the entire case, the whole thing, would end up hinging on one tiny piece of evidence, no bigger than your thumbnail.
So it's just before 7 p.m. on December 21st, 1988. People in the quiet little town of Lockerbie, Scotland, hear this massive roar, like thunder. But it wasn't a storm. For eyewitnesses like Michael Gordon, it was a waking nightmare. He looked up and saw the sky just raining fire and debris. A totally routine transatlantic flight had just become a catastrophe.
The devastation was just absolute. Pan Am Flight 103 was flying from London to New York when it just disintegrated at 31,000 feet. Everyone on that plane died. And when the main part of the fuselage and the wings, still loaded with 90,000 kilograms of jet fuel, hit the ground, they completely vaporized an entire street, killing 11 more people right in their homes. The human cost is just staggering to think about.
So, this brings us right to the first chaotic stage of this whole thing, the immediate aftermath. As investigators started arriving in Lockerbie, they were walking into a scene that one witness could only describe as being like a scene out of hell. This was the first and really the most critical question. You have two possibilities, right? Had this 18-year-old Boeing 747 just had some kind of terrible fatal mechanical failure, or was this something way more sinister? The answer to that one question would set the course for everything that came next. And to even begin to find that answer, investigators had to get their heads around the incredible scale of the problem in front of them. And honestly, it can all be summed up with a single, pretty overwhelming number.
2,000. That's the number. The plane didn't just crash, it shattered. It spread itself over 2,000 square kilometers of the Scottish countryside. Now, to put that into perspective for you, their crime scene was bigger than the entire city of London. Every single piece of that jet, from a seat cushion to the cockpit controls, had to be found, tagged, and analyzed.
So, with this enormous task ahead of them, investigators were forced down two competing paths right at the start. They had to treat both possibilities as equally real and investigate them at the same time.
So, on one hand, you've got the very real chance of a mechanical failure. I mean, the plane, the Clipper made of the seas, was one of the older 747s flying. But on the other hand, the threat of terrorism was very high at the time. An anonymous warning about a Pan Am flight out of Frankfurt had come in just weeks earlier. And get this, in the hours right after the crash, 4 different groups actually rushed to claim they did it.
With investigators being pulled in so many different directions, the case easily could have stalled out right there. But then, just 3 days after the crash, on Christmas Eve of all days, they found a clue that changed absolutely everything. You know, it really didn't look like much, just a twisted little piece of metal from the framework inside the cargo hold. But where it was found, that was the key. It was located way out in the southern part of the debris field, which meant it was one of the very first things blown off the aircraft. And it had some very strange markings on it.
And those markings told the whole story. Forensic experts saw these tiny little craters and soot marks. It's a signature known as explosive pitting. This wasn't damage you'd see from a plane just falling apart and crashing. No, this was the unmistakable fingerprint of a high-energy explosion. It was the first piece of hard evidence that this was no accident.
And once forensic tests confirmed there were traces of plastic explosives on that fragment, the entire investigation officially pivoted. The crash of Pan Am 103 was now a mass murder inquiry, and the Scottish countryside was now the world's largest crime scene. Okay, so knowing it was a bomb is one thing, but figuring out where that bomb was placed inside a 6 million part airplane that was now in a million pieces, well, that required a level of dedication that is just almost impossible to imagine. To figure out the bomb's location, investigators did something truly incredible. They collected tons and tons of wreckage, and they started to reassemble the plane's fuselage inside this massive hangar. It was like the world's most complex and, frankly, most heartbreaking jigsaw puzzle. And as they painstakingly pieced it all back together, a very clear pattern of damage started to show up. A huge hole blasted outward from the port side of the forward cargo hold. From there, by reconstructing the cargo containers that were in that specific section, they were able to narrow it down even further. The blast started inside this one specific metal container, which had the code name AVE 4041.
Think about that. The search had gone from 2,000 square kilometers down to a single metal box. So, now that they knew where the bomb was, the investigation suddenly went global. They started to trace every single item that was packed inside that container, following a trail of clues that would eventually stretch all across Europe and the Mediterranean. And this is where all these seemingly random details start to click together to form a picture. Forensic work identifies bits of a Samsonite suitcase, a type sold only in the Middle East. Fragments of clothing from inside that suitcase, they're traced to a single shop on the island of Malta. And incredibly, the shop's owner actually remembered the sale, telling investigators that the man who bought the clothes had a distinct Libyan accent. The trail was getting very, very warm. And then came the breakthrough. While a technician was sifting through all this debris, they found something just extraordinary. It was embedded in a piece of charred clothing from that very same shop in Malta, a tiny fragment of a circuit board, smaller than a fingernail. This was it. This was the needle in that 2,000 square kilometer haystack. This tiny piece of electronics, this little chip, would become the smoking gun. It was the single piece of evidence that would finally connect the bomb to its makers and, hopefully, bring them to justice. You know, FBI explosives expert Tom Thurman spent months, literally months, trying to ID this fragment, searching through files and getting nowhere. Finally, over at the CIA, he found a match. It was a timer seized from 2 Libyan agents years earlier in Africa. The second he realized they were identical, he said he got cold chills. He just knew this was it. Now, this discovery completely changed the focus of the whole investigation. See, the first suspects, a Palestinian group, were known for using crude barometric timers, the kind that are triggered by a change in altitude. But this circuit board pointed to a highly sophisticated electronic long-delay timer. It's a totally different signature, almost like a different artist's style, and it suggested a much more state-sponsored operation.
And this is where all the different threads finally came together. That timer? It was traced to a Swiss company called Mebo. They had built a special batch of just 20 of them and sold them exclusively to the Libyan government. You combine that with the clothes bought in Malta and the baggage records, and it all pointed to one man, Abdelbasset Al-Megrahi, a Libyan intelligence officer.
After years of international political standoffs, Megrahi was finally put on trial and convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison. And then, in 2003, Muammar Gaddafi's government in Libya formally accepted responsibility for the bombing and paid billions in compensation to the families of those 270 victims.
The investigation was just a monumental achievement. It was a testament to international cooperation and just plain old-fashioned detective work. And it leaves us with a pretty interesting question for today, doesn't it? As crime-solving moves more and more into the digital world of data and code, what can we learn from a case that was solved not by a hacker, but by a thumbnail-sized fragment of truth found lying in a Scottish field?